By the time Cleopatra died, Egypt was already gone, not erased from maps, not yet reduced to ruins, but finished in the way that truly matters. The long line of pharaohs, the ancient gods carved into stone, the belief that Egypt stood apart from the rest of the world, all of it had reached its final hour. Rome would survive her. Rome would write the first version of her story, but Cleopatra would not survive Rome. She has been remembered as a seductress, a manipulator, a dangerous woman who bent powerful men to her will. Yet those stories say more about fear than truth. They were written by victors who needed her to be something simpler than she was. Tonight we follow Cleopatra not as a myth and not as a scandal, but as a human being standing at the edge of a dying world, a queen raised among languages and books, ruling through intelligence rather than force, trying to preserve a civilization that had already begun to slip into history. So settle in, slow your breathing, and let the noise of the present fade. This is not the story of how Cleopatra fell. It is the story of why she became a legend. The story does not begin with Cleopatra's birth. It begins with the quiet that followed her. The kind of quiet that comes after something ancient has finally stopped breathing. When Cleopatra died, Egypt did not vanish in a single moment. The temples still stood. The Nile still ran north toward the sea. Farmers still planted and harvested as their grandparents had done. The sun still rose over the same pale deserts and fell again into the same warm horizon. And yet something essential had ended. For 3,000 years, Egypt had been more than a country. It had been a world, complete in itself, held together by ritual and memory, by gods with animal faces and kings who were treated as living bridges between earth and the divine. Time in Egypt did not rush forward the way it did in other places. It circled, it returned, it repeated. It gave the feeling that nothing truly disappeared, only changed form. But in Cleopatra's lifetime, that feeling began to fail. Far to the west, Rome was growing into something too large to ignore. It did not move in circles. It moved like a blade, forward, outward, cutting its way through the Mediterranean. One city became two, two became 10, and then, before anyone could fully understand what was happening, Rome had turned into a force that reshaped everything it touched. Egypt watched this transformation with the stillness of an old kingdom that believed itself eternal. It was not eternal, it was simply old. The dynasty that ruled when Cleopatra was born was not the dynasty of the pyramids. It was not the bloodline of the ancient pharaohs. Cleopatra was a Ptolemy, a descendant of Greek rulers who had taken Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great. They had worn the double crown and called themselves pharaohs, but their voices carried the sound of another world. Their court spoke Greek. Their kings married their sisters in a ritual imitation of the old gods, but the imitation never fully became the thing itself. Egypt, in Cleopatra's time, lived with two faces. One face turned inward toward the past, toward temples, festivals, incense, the steady rhythm of the Nile. The other face turned outward, toward Rome, toward treaties, debts, grain shipments, political bargains made in distant rooms. Cleopatra would be born into this tension, and she would learn to live inside it so completely that later ages would mistake her for the tension itself. Even her name was a clue. Cleopatra, a Greek name. It meant something like glory of the father. It belonged to the language of conquerors and philosophers, not to the language of hieroglyphs and prayers. And yet Cleopatra would become the one who stepped further into Egypt than any of her Greek ancestors ever had. She would speak to priests in their own tongue, She would appear in public not merely as a foreign queen wearing Egyptian symbols, but as a ruler who understood what those symbols meant to the people who had carried them for centuries. That alone would make her unusual. But Cleopatra would become more than unusual. She would become famous in the most dangerous way, because when you live at the boundary of two worlds, one old and one rising, you become a canvas for other people's fears. And Rome, above all, was afraid of what it could not control. It is easy from a distance to think of Cleopatra as an inevitable legend, as if the world was waiting for her, as if her name carried destiny inside it like a sealed letter. But real lives do not feel inevitable from the inside. From the inside, a life feels like a series of rooms you enter one by one, not knowing what is behind the next door. Cleopatra did not begin as a legend. She began as a girl inside a palace. A girl who grew up in Alexandria, a city that glittered at the edge of the sea like a polished coin. Alexandria was not ancient in the way Thebes was ancient, or Memphis, or the temples that rose out of desert silence. Alexandria was young, built by foreigners, filled with ships, stacked with marble, loud with languages. In Alexandria you could hear the world, Greek merchants arguing in the streets, Egyptian laborers calling to one another in the sun, Jewish scholars reading quietly in shaded courtyards, Roman envoys arriving with guarded smiles, sailors, poets, soldiers, priests, a city where ideas moved as quickly as ships. And inside that city stood a thing that was almost unbelievable, the library, not just shelves of scrolls, but an ambition, the ambition to gather every word worth saving, every thought worth keeping, a place where the past of the world was stored in fragile paper and ink, as if knowledge itself could prevent history from repeating its cruelties. Cleopatra grew up near that ambition, and in a world where power was becoming sharper, faster, more brutal, she learned something that few rulers ever truly understand. A kingdom can lose its armies, it can lose its gold, it can even lose its borders. But if it loses its story, then it loses everything. Cleopatra would spend her life trying not to lose Egypt's story, and Rome would spend its life trying to rewrite it. That is why, even now, she remains difficult to hold. When people speak her name, they rarely speak about the Nile's slow mornings, or the smell of ink and papyrus, or the heat rising from stone walls at sunset. They speak about passion, about seduction, about drama. Rome taught the world to speak that way, because it was easier for Rome to say Cleopatra was a temptress than to admit she was a ruler. It was easier to call her a witch than to admit she was intelligent. It was easier to reduce her to romance than to confront the fact that she understood the machinery of empire, as well as any man who wore a Roman cloak. So tonight we will move slowly. We will listen for what survives under the noise. We will follow Cleopatra before the legend hardened around her, before the world decided what she was allowed to be, and we will begin where every life truly begins, not with a crown, but with a world already in motion and a child learning quietly how to see it. Cleopatra was born into a kingdom that remembered greatness more clearly than it possessed it. Egypt had once shaped the ancient world. Its gods had traveled across borders. Its monuments had frightened time itself. Long before Rome was more than a cluster of hills, Egypt had already learned how to turn stone into eternity. But by the 1st century before our era, that eternity had begun to thin, like fabric worn smooth by centuries of use. What remained was not weakness, but fragility. Egypt still fed the Mediterranean. The Nile's floods continued to arrive with quiet precision, laying down black soil year after year. Grain ships still left Egyptian ports, heavy with food that kept distant cities alive. Rome, vast and restless, depended on that grain more than it liked to admit. In this sense, Egypt remained indispensable. But indispensability is not the same as independence. Power had shifted westward, slowly at first, Then, all at once, Rome had learned how to turn discipline into domination. Its armies moved with mechanical certainty. Its laws followed its legions. Where Rome arrived, local kings were allowed to survive, briefly, so long as they remembered who now decided the future. Egypt understood this danger, but understanding did not mean escape. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled from Alexandria, a city built not by Egyptians but for Egypt. It was a Greek city placed carefully on African soil, facing outward toward the sea rather than inward toward the desert. Marble columns replaced mud brick. Greek philosophy echoed where ancient prayers once lingered. It was a capital that looked forward, not back, and in doing so never fully belonged to either direction. The rulers themselves lived in this in-between state. They called themselves pharaohs. They wore Egyptian crowns. They performed rituals meant to please ancient gods, but they governed as Hellenistic monarchs, surrounded by courtiers trained in Greek rhetoric and intrigue. They married within their own family, copying old Egyptian customs without fully understanding their meaning. Tradition became performance. Symbol replaced belief. For the people, this distance was felt quietly. Egyptians still brought offerings to temples. Priests still chanted names that had been spoken for thousands of years. But real decisions were made elsewhere, inside palace corridors, behind closed doors, in conversations that referenced Rome more often than the gods. Cleopatra was born into this layered reality. She did not inherit a stable throne or a united court. She inherited tension. She inherited a kingdom balancing on reputation and memory. And she inherited a dangerous truth that Egypt's greatest strength, its age, was now also its greatest vulnerability. Because old things inspire reverence, but they also invite conquest. Rome admired Egypt. Romans traveled there, wrote about it, dreamed of it. They were fascinated by its temples, its mysteries, its sense of permanence. But admiration did not soften ambition. It sharpened it. Egypt was too rich, too symbolic, too essential to be allowed to remain fully itself. And so Rome hovered, sometimes as an ally, sometimes as a creditor, always as a threat. When Cleopatra was still a child, Roman politics were already casting long shadows over her future. Generals rose and fell, alliances shifted, civil wars burned through Italy and beyond. Egypt watched carefully, knowing that every Roman conflict eventually reached its shores. The palace was not insulated from this world. Inside its walls, Cleopatra would have heard conversations she was never meant to remember, names spoken with caution, messengers arriving late at night, advisors arguing in low voices about grain shipments, debts, promises made to Rome and promises quietly broken. Children notice more than adults think. Cleopatra grew up surrounded by warning. She learned early that power did not announce itself loudly. It moved quietly, through documents and marriages, through debts that could never truly be repaid. She learned that rulers who believed themselves untouchable rarely survived long, and she learned that Egypt's safety depended not on isolation but on navigation, on knowing when to bend and when to resist. Unlike many children born into royalty, Cleopatra was not shielded from complexity. The palace was not a sanctuary. It was a place where danger wore refined faces, where siblings could become rivals, where loyalty shifted with the season. The world she inherited was already cracking. Rome was growing more centralized, more ruthless. The old republic was hollowing itself out, preparing, unknowingly, for empire. Egypt, ancient and heavy with memory, stood directly in its path. Cleopatra did not yet know her role in this collision. She did not know that she would one day be blamed for Rome's anxieties, painted as the embodiment of everything it feared about the East: luxury, excess, emotional power. She did not know that her name would outlive the institutions that judged her. But she was learning the shape of the world she lived in. She was learning that history was no longer slow, and that Egypt, for all its age, was running out of time. The kingdom into which Cleopatra was born was not waiting to be saved. It was waiting to be decided. And that decision, whether Egypt would fade quietly or fight to define its own ending, would eventually rest in her hands. For now, though, she was still only a child, listening, watching, learning how an old world begins to fall apart, one careful silence at a time. Cleopatra grew up surrounded by walls that were meant to protect her. The royal palace of Alexandria did not rise from the desert like the temples of Upper Egypt. It faced the sea, its windows opened toward harbors crowded with ships, their sails folding and unfolding like white birds. From the palace balconies, one could watch merchants arrive from Cyprus, Syria, Greece and Italy. Alexandria breathed in the world and exhaled ideas. This was not a city of silence. It was a city of voices. Inside the palace, marble floors echoed with footsteps at every hour. Courtiers passed through halls heavy with incense and ambition. Messengers came and went, carrying news not only from within Egypt, but from Rome, from Asia Minor, from islands scattered across the Mediterranean like punctuation marks in a long sentence. Cleopatra was born into this movement. She was not raised in isolation, nor taught to believe that royalty existed apart from the world beyond its gates. The palace did not feel like a fortress, it felt like a crossroads. And from an early age, Cleopatra learned that power did not reside only in armies or crowns, but in attention, where it flowed, where it lingered, and where it turned away. Her education reflected this understanding. Unlike many children of royal blood, Cleopatra was not shaped solely by ritual or etiquette. She was taught to read deeply, to listen carefully, and to question what others accepted without thought. Tutors instructed her in mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, astronomy. She learned history not as a list of names, but as a pattern of causes and consequences. Empires did not fall because of fate. They fell because of decisions, and nowhere was this lesson more present than in the shadow of the library. The Library of Alexandria was not simply a building, it was an idea made physical. Its goal was nothing less than impossible: to gather all human knowledge and place it within reach. Scrolls arrived from every corner of the known world. Ships entering the harbor were searched for books. Originals were copied. The copies were returned. The originals stayed. Knowledge was treated like a resource, like grain, like gold. Cleopatra grew up knowing that this place existed, not as a monument, but as a living organism. Scholars debated inside its walls. Translators worked patiently, turning one language into another. Ideas moved freely across cultures, long before borders tried to stop them. For a child raised near such a place, curiosity became inevitable. Cleopatra learned early that the world could be understood through language, that the same truth could wear different words, that a ruler who could move between meanings could move between peoples. While others memorized doctrines, she absorbed perspectives. She was surrounded by books, but also by their limits. Knowledge did not protect the library from fire. It did not protect Alexandria from politics. Cleopatra would learn this slowly, as all intelligent children do, realizing that understanding the world does not guarantee control over it, but it does offer something else: choice. Cleopatra was not raised to be obedient. She was raised to be capable. That distinction would matter later, when obedience would be demanded and capability would become dangerous. The palace taught her how to stand, how to speak, how to remain still while others spoke around her. But the library taught her something quieter and more enduring: how to think beyond the room she was standing in. She learned about Egypt's past, not as myth alone, but as continuity, about pharaohs who had ruled for decades, and gods who demanded balance rather than conquest. At the same time, she learned Greek philosophy, where power was debated rather than inherited, and Roman history, where ambition rewarded those willing to act decisively. Cleopatra did not belong fully to any single tradition, and because of that, she belonged to all of them a little. This unsettled the people around her. In a court where identity was tightly controlled, where Greek rulers pretended to be Egyptian kings, Cleopatra's genuine curiosity about Egypt itself stood out. She listened to priests not as ornaments of ritual, but as keepers of memory. She asked questions that were not expected of her. She noticed details others overlooked: the Nile, the calendar, the relationship between flood and famine. These were not abstractions, they were the mechanics of survival. Cleopatra was learning to see her kingdom not as a stage, but as a system, and yet for all this learning she was still a child. She moved through shaded corridors where power was spoken softly. She watched older siblings form alliances and resentments. She sensed the unspoken tension beneath formal smiles. The palace, for all its beauty, was not a safe place. It was a place where proximity to the throne mattered more than affection. Cleopatra learned caution early. She learned when to speak and when silence carried more weight. She learned that listening was often mistaken for weakness, and that mistake could be useful. The library gave her imagination. The palace gave her restraint. Together they shaped a ruler who would later be described as many things: brilliant, dangerous, manipulative, but rarely as what she truly was: prepared for a world that would not forgive her youth, prepared for a kingdom that could not afford mistakes, prepared for a future where knowledge would be her most reliable defense. She did not yet know that exile, war, and loss were waiting, but she was already learning how to survive them. In the quiet hours of study and observation, Cleopatra was becoming something unusual in a fading world, a ruler shaped not only by inheritance, but by understanding. And understanding, in times like hers, was a form of courage. Cleopatra learned early that power does not always speak loudly. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it listens, and sometimes it waits for the right words. In the royal court of Alexandria, language was never neutral. Greek was the language of governance, of philosophy, of official record. It was the tongue of the Ptolemies, the sound of legitimacy within the palace walls. Egyptian, meanwhile, belonged to the temples, to ritual, to the people who worked the land and followed the river's cycles with ancient precision. Most rulers of Cleopatra's dynasty never crossed that divide. They ruled Egypt without speaking to it. Cleopatra noticed this, and she understood, even as a young woman, that a ruler who could not speak to her people was always ruling on borrowed time. She made a choice that none of her predecessors had fully made before her. She learned Egyptian, not as a ceremonial gesture, not as a performance, but as a living language. This decision mattered more than it appeared to. Language carries more than meaning. It carries memory, belonging, recognition. When Cleopatra spoke to Egyptian priests in their own tongue, she was not merely translating words, she was translating authority. She was saying, without spectacle, "I see you." Beyond Egyptian and Greek, Cleopatra studied the languages of neighboring kingdoms: Aramaic, Hebrew, the dialects of traders and diplomats. Each language opened a different door. Each one allowed her to hear what others missed. In a world defined by negotiation and threat, understanding became leverage. Cleopatra's voice, those who heard it said later, was not particularly loud. It was controlled, measured, flexible. She knew how to adjust her tone to the room she stood in, to sound reflective in one moment and decisive in another. She did not dominate conversations by force. She guided them. This was not an accident. Cleopatra had learned rhetoric not as ornament, but as survival. She understood how stories persuaded more effectively than commands, how pauses carried as much weight as declarations, how silence, used deliberately, could make others reveal more than they intended. She learned that most people spoke in order to be heard. She spoke in order to understand. This made her dangerous. In the palace, her abilities unsettled older advisors who were accustomed to rulers who followed predictable patterns. Cleopatra did not fit easily into expectations. She asked for explanations. She remembered details. She followed arguments beyond their surface, and she noticed contradictions contradictions, especially the ones people hoped she would overlook. Power, she learned, rarely presented itself honestly. It dressed itself in tradition, in urgency, in supposed inevitability. Cleopatra learned to question all of it. Language also allowed her to move between identities. In public ceremonies, she appeared as the living image of Isis, aligning herself with Egyptian divinity. In private negotiations, she spoke as a Hellenistic monarch trained in Greek logic and persuasion. When Roman envoys arrived, she understood not only their words, but the political assumptions embedded within them. Rome spoke the language of law and dominance. It believed power should be visible, enforceable, final. Cleopatra spoke something more fluid. She spoke continuity. She understood that Egypt could not confront Rome directly, not militarily, not economically, but it could still influence Rome by becoming necessary, by positioning itself not as a rival, but as an irreplaceable partner. Words made that possible. Through language, Cleopatra framed Egypt not as a relic of the past, but as a living center of stability. She presented herself not as a fragile queen, but as a capable intermediary between worlds. Rome did not need Egypt's admiration, it needed Egypt's cooperation. Cleopatra intended to ensure that cooperation came on her terms. This strategy required patience, it required discipline, and it required the ability to remain underestimated. Many around her assumed her learning was ornamental, that her education existed to make her impressive, not effective. They mistook fluency for softness. They mistook curiosity for compliance. Cleopatra allowed this misunderstanding to persist. The most enduring power, she understood, is often invisible until it is too late to counter. Language shaped how she thought as well. Moving between tongues trained her mind to hold multiple interpretations at once. She became comfortable with ambiguity, comfortable with complexity, comfortable with contradictions. These traits did not make her beloved, they made her prepared. In the years to come, Cleopatra would face moments where armies could not save her, where wealth could not protect her, where ancestry would offer no shield. In those moments, she would rely on something quieter, her voice, her understanding, her ability to speak into the space between fear and desire. That is why Rome would later describe her not as a ruler, but as an enchantress, because Rome did not like to admit that words, when wielded carefully, could rival swords. Cleopatra never believed in magic, she believed in language, and in a world rushing toward domination, she chose to master the one power that could still slow it down. Cleopatra did not inherit a throne in the way stories like to imagine. There was no single solemn moment when the crown was placed upon her head and the future opened obediently before her. Power in Egypt did not pass cleanly from one ruler to the next. It fractured, it hesitated, it invited struggle. Cleopatra inherited not certainty, but obligation. When her father, Ptolemy XII, died, Egypt was already exhausted by compromise. His reign had been defined by appeasement, particularly toward Rome. He had paid enormous sums to secure Roman recognition of his rule, draining Egypt's wealth to protect his position. The kingdom survived, but at a cost that could not be ignored. Cleopatra was still very young when the responsibility fell upon her. By tradition, she did not rule alone. The Ptolemaic system demanded co-rulers, often siblings bound together in uneasy partnerships. Cleopatra was paired with her younger brother, a boy who carried the title of king, but none of its understanding. Their names were spoken together in official documents, but power was never shared equally. From the beginning, Cleopatra sensed the imbalance. She was older, better educated, more capable, but the court did not reward capability, it rewarded influence. And influence gathered around those who were easiest to control. Her brother's advisors moved quickly. They saw in Cleopatra not a partner, but a threat, a queen who spoke too confidently, who appeared too independently, who did not rely on them to interpret the world. They whispered that she was ambitious, that she was impatient, that she did not understand her place. The language of tradition was used against her. She was reminded of protocol, of custom, of the supposed necessity of unity. But beneath these words lay fear, fear that Cleopatra would not be ruled through them, and fear that Egypt, under her guidance, might stop behaving as Rome expected. Cleopatra did not respond with violence. She responded with presence. She appeared alone on official documents, subtly removing her brother's name. She addressed priests directly. She presented herself publicly as the active ruler of Egypt, not merely its symbolic figurehead. These gestures were small, but they carried weight. They signaled intent, and intent in a fragile court was dangerous. The palace grew colder. Conversations stopped when Cleopatra entered rooms. Advisors aligned themselves carefully. The familiar instability of sibling rule hardened into opposition. Cleopatra felt the shift, but she did not retreat. She understood something essential. Hesitation would be interpreted as weakness, but strength, when isolated, invites attack. Her brother's advisors struck first, not with soldiers but with procedure. Cleopatra was accused of overstepping, of violating tradition, of acting without consent. They framed her authority as illegitimate, her independence as rebellion. In Egypt's court, where appearances often mattered more than reality, this was enough. Cleopatra was forced out, not dramatically, not publicly, but decisively. She left Alexandria stripped of her authority, removed from the palace that had shaped her since childhood, the city she knew so well. The harbor, the library, the corridors of power closed itself behind her. Exile did not arrive as chaos, it arrived as quiet. Cleopatra found herself outside the center of her own kingdom, with no army large enough to challenge her enemies directly. She had lost the throne, but she had not lost her understanding of the world. She did not despair. She observed. She learned who had moved against her and why. She learned how quickly loyalty shifted when Rome's approval was at stake. She learned that Egypt's fate could no longer be decided solely within its own borders. This was the moment when Cleopatra's education became something more than preparation. It became necessity. She began to gather support where she could, among those who still believed in her claim, and among those who recognized her intelligence as an asset rather than a threat. She watched Rome carefully, aware that the empire's internal conflicts were reaching Egypt's doorstep. Cleopatra did not see her exile as an ending. She saw it as a pause. History, she understood, was rarely linear. Power moved in cycles. It receded before it returned. Those who survived learned how to wait, and Cleopatra waited. She waited for the world to shift again. She waited for Rome to look toward Egypt. She waited for an opportunity that could not be forced. The throne she had lost was never truly secure. The throne she intended to reclaim would require something different. Not force, not tradition, but timing. Cleopatra had been pushed out of her kingdom, but she was not finished ruling it. Exile, Cleopatra discovered, did not always mean distance. Sometimes it meant remaining close enough to see what had been taken from you, close enough to feel its absence every day. Cleopatra did not flee Egypt. She was pushed to its margins, forced away from the center where decisions were made, but still surrounded by the land that had shaped her. The desert stretched out beyond the city, indifferent to dynasties. The Nile continued its slow, reliable movement northward, carrying life as it always had. Egypt itself did not reject her. People did. The court in Alexandria moved on quickly. Her brother's name replaced hers in proclamations. Advisors spoke as if Cleopatra had already become a memory. Official rituals continued, carefully stripped of her presence. The palace did not burn. It simply forgot her. Cleopatra watched this transformation with clarity. She understood that power did not vanish when a ruler was removed. It reorganized itself. Those who had once bowed to her now bowed elsewhere, not necessarily out of loyalty, But out of habit, survival demanded adaptation. Cleopatra adapted. She moved through border regions and allied territories, gathering what support she could without drawing attention. She was no longer protected by ceremony. She traveled without the insulation of palace walls, seeing Egypt as few rulers ever had. From the outside, this perspective changed her. She saw villages that existed far from Alexandria's marble and libraries. She saw the way Roman influence seeped quietly into trade and administration. She heard rumors spoken without caution about Rome's demands, about Egypt's debts, about how long the kingdom could continue pretending to be sovereign. Exile stripped away illusion. It taught Cleopatra that Egypt's survival would not be secured by symbols alone. The crown and the rituals mattered, but only when backed by strategy. The world had become too sharp for nostalgia, and yet Cleopatra did not harden into bitterness. She remained attentive. She understood that her removal had not occurred in isolation. It was part of a larger pattern, one repeated across the Mediterranean. Local rulers were being weakened, replaced, or absorbed. Egypt was not unique. It was simply late. Cleopatra began to think beyond her immediate enemies. Her brother's advisors were obstacles, but they were not the true threat. Rome was. Rome hovered behind every decision, every alliance, every act of betrayal. Rome did not need to act directly. Its influence was already embedded. Cleopatra realized something unsettling. She had been removed not because she was weak, but because she was unpredictable. She did not fit neatly into Rome's expectations of a compliant client ruler. She asked too many questions. She spoke too confidently. She appeared too capable of independent thought. For Rome, unpredictability was unacceptable. This realization sharpened Cleopatra's resolve. She began preparing for return, not through immediate confrontation but through patience. She gathered resources quietly. She built relationships beyond the court. She waited for the moment when Rome itself would require her. That moment was coming. Far away, Roman politics were tearing themselves apart. Alliances collapsed, civil war loomed, generals moved their forces across seas and continents, dragging the fate of smaller kingdoms behind them like nets. Egypt could not remain untouched. Cleopatra understood that when Rome turned its full attention toward Egypt, the situation would change rapidly. Whoever controlled Alexandria at that moment would matter less than who could make themselves necessary to Rome's interests. Exile became preparation. She learned to think like an outsider because she had become one. She learned to read power from a distance. She learned to survive without spectacle. And in that survival, she refined something rare among rulers: restraint. Cleopatra did not lash out. She did not declare herself wronged. She allowed others to believe she had been neutralized. The more invisible she became, the more dangerous she grew. When Rome finally arrived in Egypt again, it would not be greeted by a passive kingdom. It would be greeted by a queen who had learned how to wait. Exile had taken Cleopatra away from her throne, but it had given her something else: perspective. And perspective in a collapsing world was power in its purest form. Rome did not arrive in Alexandria as a conqueror. It arrived as a judge. When Julius Caesar crossed the Mediterranean and stepped onto Egyptian soil, he did so not to annex a kingdom, but to settle accounts. Rome was exhausted by its own civil wars. Power had concentrated in the hands of men who no longer pretended to serve a republic. Caesar came to Egypt carrying authority that did not require explanation. Egypt felt his arrival immediately. The harbor stirred with unease. Messengers moved faster than usual. Advisors spoke with forced calm. Cleopatra's brother, still young and surrounded by men who spoke for him, believed that Caesar could be managed, that Rome, like before, could be appeased with promises and payment. Cleopatra understood this was a dangerous misunderstanding. Rome was no longer negotiating from a position of need. It was negotiating from dominance. Caesar had not come seeking alliance. He had come to impose order, Rome's version of it. Alexandria, for all its beauty, was not prepared for such a presence. Caesar took residence in the palace, placing himself physically at the center of Egypt's power. This act alone spoke volumes. He did not wait to be invited. He did not acknowledge local authority as equal. He positioned himself as the final arbiter. Egypt had not been conquered by legions. It had been occupied by attention. Cleopatra, still in exile, watched carefully. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She understood something that others did not. Caesar did not care who ruled Egypt. He cared that Egypt remained stable, predictable, and useful to Rome. Whoever could guarantee that would gain his support. Cleopatra prepared her return not as a rebellion, but as a solution. She did not march toward Alexandria with an army. She did not declare herself queen by force. She approached Caesar as a ruler who could restore balance to a fractured kingdom. The story of her arrival would later become legend. She was said to have been smuggled into the palace wrapped in a rug or a sack or a bundle of cloth, carried past guards who did not think to question its contents. The details vary. What matters is not how she entered, but why. Cleopatra understood the power of staging. She presented herself to Caesar not as a desperate exile, but as a composed sovereign who had chosen the right moment to reappear. She did not beg, she explained. She did not accuse, she clarified. Egypt, she argued, was unraveling. Her brother was too young. His advisors too self-interested. The kingdom required firm, intelligent leadership. Rome required stability. Cleopatra offered both. Caesar listened. He saw before him not a romantic figure, but a political asset, a ruler who spoke his language, who understood the mechanics of power, who could secure Egypt without prolonged conflict. The decision was pragmatic. Cleopatra was restored to the throne. Her brother was forced into cooperation, his authority diminished by Roman presence. Alexandria, once again, belonged to her, but nothing was the same. Rome now stood inside Egypt's halls of power. Caesar's soldiers occupied strategic positions. Roman interests were no longer implied, they were explicit. Cleopatra had reclaimed her crown. She had also accepted Rome's shadow. This alliance was not built on affection, it was built on necessity. Caesar needed Egypt's grain. Cleopatra needed Rome's recognition. Each understood the other's leverage. Yet within this calculated partnership, something more subtle unfolded. Cleopatra watched Caesar closely. She observed how he commanded loyalty, how he navigated opposition, how he balanced force and spectacle. She learned from him, not as a student, but as a peer, studying a rival system. Caesar, in turn, recognized Cleopatra's intelligence. She did not flatter him excessively. She did not perform submission. She spoke as a ruler who understood her own value. This, more than beauty or charm, distinguished her. Alexandria became a temporary center of the Roman world. Decisions made there echoed across the Mediterranean, and Cleopatra stood at the center of those decisions, her position secured not by tradition alone, but by her ability to adapt to the new reality. Rome had arrived in Alexandria, and Cleopatra had ensured that she would not be crushed beneath its weight. Instead, she had positioned herself where she always intended to be, inside the moment when history turned. Cleopatra and Julius Caesar did not meet as characters in a romance. They met as two figures shaped by instability, standing at the center of collapsing systems. Each understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in the room, that the world they had inherited was no longer sustainable in its old form. Caesar was a general who had crossed a point of return. He had defeated his rivals, marched against the institutions that once restrained him, and emerged as Rome's dominant force. But dominance came with danger. He ruled a city that still pretended to be a republic, a people uneasy with the word king. Cleopatra ruled a kingdom that still pretended to be eternal. Their alliance formed not from desire, but from recognition. Cleopatra understood that Caesar represented the future, disciplined, centralized, expansive. Caesar understood that Cleopatra represented something Rome could not easily replace: continuity, wealth, legitimacy in the East. Each offered the other what they lacked. This balance made their relationship effective. Cleopatra did not abandon her role as queen in Caesar's presence. She did not diminish herself to become agreeable. She spoke as a ruler, securing her kingdom's survival. Caesar, accustomed to obedience, found this refreshing rather than threatening. Alexandria became their shared space. While Caesar remained in Egypt, the palace transformed into a place of discussion rather than command. Decisions unfolded slowly, shaped by conversation rather than decree. Cleopatra guided Caesar through the complexity of Egyptian governance, explaining what could be changed and what could not. He listened, not because he was persuaded emotionally, but because Cleopatra's arguments were precise. She understood systems. She spoke in terms of outcomes, not ideals. Egypt, she argued, could remain stable if allowed to govern itself under Roman oversight rather than direct control. Caesar accepted this. He did not wish to rule Egypt personally. He wished to secure it. In return, Cleopatra gained more than restoration. She gained time to strengthen her position, time to reassert authority over the court, time to present herself publicly not as Rome's subordinate, but as Egypt's rightful ruler supported by Rome's most powerful man. Symbolism mattered. Cleopatra appeared beside Caesar in public ceremonies. She emphasized continuity, not dependence. The message was subtle but clear. Egypt remained Egypt. Rome was an ally, not a master. Privately, their relationship deepened. They spoke late into the night, discussing philosophy, history, and the nature of power. Cleopatra shared her vision of Egypt not as a relic but as a living kingdom capable of adaptation. Caesar, increasingly isolated by his authority, found in her a mind that did not fear him. This intellectual intimacy mattered more than any physical closeness. Cleopatra did not enchant Caesar through mystery. She engaged him through clarity. The court watched carefully. To some, Cleopatra appeared to be aligning herself dangerously close to Roman ambition. To others, she seemed to be controlling Rome through proximity. Both interpretations missed the point. Cleopatra was not seeking dominance over Caesar. She was securing Egypt's relevance. When Caesar eventually prepared to leave Egypt, the balance they had created remained intact. Cleopatra's throne was no longer contested openly. Her brother's influence had collapsed. Egypt stood stable for the moment, but stability was fragile. Caesar's departure marked the end of one chapter and the quiet beginning of another. Cleopatra had tied her fate to Rome more closely than any Egyptian ruler before her. This connection would protect her or expose her, depending on how events unfolded. Cleopatra understood the risk. She accepted it because she also understood something else. Isolation was no longer an option. Egypt could not retreat into its past. It had to move forward, even if that path led through Rome. The queen and the general parted not as lovers in a story, but as partners in a political arrangement that would reshape both their worlds. And in the space they created together, something irreversible began to take shape. Cleopatra was no longer simply ruling Egypt. She was now part of Rome's story. The child changed everything. When Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Egypt did not celebrate with the noise of conquest or triumph. The moment arrived quietly, wrapped in careful words and measured gestures. This was not merely the birth of an heir, it was the arrival of a symbol, one that neither Rome nor Egypt knew how to handle. The child was named Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar. Most people would remember him by a simpler name, Caesarion. To Cleopatra, he was continuity made flesh. To Rome, he was a complication. Cleopatra understood what this child represented the instant she held him. Egypt had long survived through dynasties, through bloodlines that tied rulers to gods and ancestors. A child secured legitimacy. It promised stability. It quieted uncertainty, but Caesarion carried something unprecedented. He embodied two worlds at once. His mother was the last true sovereign of Egypt. His father was the most powerful man Rome had ever produced. This combination was not romantic, it was political in the most dangerous sense. Caesarion suggested a future where Egypt and Rome were not merely allies, but intertwined. A future Rome was not prepared to imagine. Cleopatra was careful. She did not rush to announce claims that would provoke reaction. She presented Caesarion first and foremost as Egypt's heir. The child appeared in traditional imagery associated with Egyptian gods, framed as the continuation of pharaonic authority. But the name lingered. Caesarion. Rome heard it whether Cleopatra spoke it loudly or not. For Caesar, the child carried weight he could not fully acknowledge. In Rome, power depended on appearances, on legal fiction, on maintaining the illusion that the republic still functioned. Acknowledging a son born to a foreign queen threatened that illusion. Caesar did not deny the child, but he did not claim him publicly either. This silence spoke volumes. Cleopatra understood the restraint. She did not push Caesar into a declaration that would endanger them both. She had learned long ago that forcing the future only invited resistance. Instead, she focused on the present. She ruled Egypt with renewed authority. The court stabilized. Ritual and administration aligned behind her. Caesarion was woven into Egypt's symbolic language, presented as the child who would one day ensure continuity. The people accepted him easily. Children of kings always do. Rome, however, did not forget. Whispers traveled west with merchants and envoys. Senators spoke cautiously. Rivals watched carefully. The idea that Caesar might have an heir outside Rome unsettled a political culture built on control and lineage. Cleopatra was aware of every whisper. She knew that her son made her stronger and more vulnerable. Caesarion protected her position in Egypt, but he also tied her fate irrevocably to Rome's internal conflicts. The world was changing again. Caesar returned to Rome, carrying with him victories, enemies, and unfinished questions. Cleopatra remained in Egypt, ruling alone, her authority intact but dependent on a fragile balance she did not control. She raised her son within the palace, surrounded by tutors, priests, and careful symbolism. Caesarion was shown the Nile, the temples, the rhythms of Egypt. Cleopatra ensured he belonged fully to the land he would inherit. But she did not pretend the future would be simple. She understood that Caesarion's existence challenged Rome's narrative of itself. Rome tolerated kings. It tolerated client states. But it did not tolerate alternatives to its own lineage of power. Cleopatra watched Rome from a distance. She watched as Caesar consolidated authority, as honors accumulated around his name, as resentment hardened into conspiracy. She sensed the tension building, the way systems strain before collapse, and she prepared herself. Cleopatra did not yet know how the story would break. She did not know that Caesar would soon fall beneath knives in a Roman Senate. She did not know that her son's name would become a liability rather than a promise. But she knew this: a child can anchor a future or expose it. Caesarion had given Cleopatra a vision of continuity beyond her own life. But he had also placed her at the center of a conflict far larger than Egypt. Two worlds had come together in him, and the world that survived would decide what that union meant. The news arrived from Rome like a sudden stillness. Julius Caesar was dead. There were no omens in Alexandria that morning. The sea did not darken. The city did not cry out. And yet, in a single moment, the balance Cleopatra had so carefully maintained collapsed inward. Caesar had been assassinated in the Senate, struck down by men who claimed to be saving the Republic. His body lay at the foot of a statue. Rome once again was tearing itself apart. For Cleopatra, the loss was immediate and absolute. Caesar had been more than an ally. He had been a stabilizing force, a guarantee that Egypt's position would not be casually undone. With his death, that guarantee vanished. Rome was no longer unified. Power fractured into ambition, vengeance and fear. Cleopatra stood alone. She was still queen. Egypt still obeyed her. The court still moved at her command. But the invisible protection that had surrounded her since Caesar's arrival dissolved. Every promise tied to his authority became uncertain. Cleopatra felt the distance between Alexandria and Rome widen. She had learned long ago that distance could be dangerous. Now it was lethal. She did not react publicly. There were no displays of grief that could be interpreted as weakness, no declarations that could provoke suspicion. Cleopatra ruled as she always had, calm, composed, attentive. But privately, she reassessed everything. Rome was unstable. Her son's position was uncertain. Her own safety depended on forces beyond Egypt's control. Cleopatra understood that she could no longer rely on association alone. She would need to navigate Rome's chaos without the anchor of a single powerful patron. She turned inward. The palace became quieter. Decisions were made with greater care. Advisors were watched more closely. Cleopatra trusted fewer people, but listened more carefully to those she did. Caesarion was still a child. Cleopatra looked at him differently now, not only as an heir, but as a vulnerability. His name tied him to a man Rome now publicly condemned, even as it quietly benefited from everything he had built. She protected him through distance. Caesarion was kept within Egypt's symbolic world, associated with divine imagery and tradition rather than Roman politics. Cleopatra emphasized his Egyptian identity, subtly distancing him from Rome's immediate conflicts. At the same time, she prepared. Cleopatra strengthened Egypt's internal stability. She secured grain supplies. She maintained diplomatic silence with Rome, neither aligning herself prematurely nor withdrawing completely. She understood that Rome's next ruler, or rulers, had not yet emerged. Patience became her strategy again. Rome descended into chaos. Caesar's assassination did not restore the Republic. It exposed its hollowness. Former allies became enemies. Armies shifted allegiance. Men who had once served Caesar now competed to inherit his power. Cleopatra watched from afar. She did not interfere. She did not offer support. She waited for clarity to emerge from confusion. She knew that choosing the wrong side too early could be fatal. For the first time since reclaiming her throne, Cleopatra ruled without external support, alone. This solitude sharpened her. She no longer spoke as Rome's partner. She spoke as Egypt's guardian. She reminded priests and officials alike that Egypt had survived centuries of change and could survive Rome's instability as well. But she did not deceive herself. Egypt could endure only so long without alignment. Rome would eventually stabilize, and when it did, it would demand clarity from its allies. Cleopatra would have to choose again. In the meantime, she ruled. She walked the palace corridors at night, listening to the echoes of her own footsteps. She considered how easily power evaporated, how dependent even the strongest alliances were on individual lives. Caesar's death taught her something no book ever could. History does not pause for grief, it accelerates. Cleopatra was no longer protected by a general. She was protected only by her ability to adapt. And in Rome, new figures were already rising, men who would look eastward and see Egypt not as a partner, but as a prize. Cleopatra felt their attention long before their ships appeared. She was alone on the throne, and the world was rearranging itself once more. Rome does not remain empty for long. Where Caesar's absence created chaos, it also created opportunity. Power does not disappear when a ruler falls. It scatters, waiting to be gathered by someone bold enough to claim it. In the years following Caesar's death, Rome was no longer governed by institutions, but by men. Cleopatra watched this transformation with disciplined distance. She received fragments of information through merchants, envoys, and carefully worded letters. Names repeated themselves. Alliances shifted. Battles were fought and unfought in rapid succession. Rome was not healing, it was consolidating. From the confusion, a new structure emerged. 3 men divided the Roman world between them. Territories were assigned. Enemies were named. The Mediterranean was reorganized not through tradition but through necessity. And among these men was one who would soon step into Cleopatra's story, Mark Antony. Antony was not like Caesar. Where Caesar was controlled and precise, Antony was expansive. He moved through the world with physical presence, with emotion close to the surface. He had fought beside Caesar, risen through loyalty rather than calculation, and now found himself holding immense power in the East. Cleopatra noticed the difference immediately. Antony governed regions closest to Egypt. His authority extended across Asia Minor, Syria, and the eastern Mediterranean. Rome had placed him there not because he was cautious, but because he was effective. This made him dangerous. Cleopatra understood that Antony represented Rome's next approach toward Egypt. Not subtle, not restrained, but personal, emotional, direct. She prepared carefully. When Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him, the invitation was not framed as diplomacy between equals. It was a command. Rome expected Egypt to explain itself, its loyalty, its silence, its future intentions. Cleopatra did not refuse, but she did not arrive humbly. She traveled to meet Antony with deliberate ceremony, turning the encounter into something he could not ignore or dismiss. She understood that Antony responded not to legal argument alone, but to presence, to spectacle that carried authority. Cleopatra presented herself not as a subordinate ruler seeking approval, but as the embodiment of Egypt itself. This strategy worked. Antony was accustomed to command. He was not accustomed to being met by someone who neither resisted nor submitted, but instead redirected the dynamic entirely. Cleopatra spoke to him calmly. She did not rush to defend herself against accusations of disloyalty. She reframed the conversation. Egypt had remained stable. Egypt had not interfered in Rome's internal conflicts. Egypt had continued to supply grain. Egypt had behaved responsibly. Antony listened. He recognized what Caesar had recognized before him. Cleopatra was not a liability. She was an asset, a ruler who could manage Egypt without constant Roman oversight, a queen who understood the limits of force and the power of alignment. This recognition shifted everything. Cleopatra did not seek Antony's affection. She sought clarity. She needed to know whether Rome intended to treat Egypt as a partner or a possession. Antony, in turn, needed Egypt's wealth and stability to secure his own position against rivals in the West. Their interests aligned, but alignment always carries cost. Antony was drawn to Cleopatra's intelligence, her composure, her refusal to perform submission. She was unlike the Roman women he knew, less constrained by custom, less apologetic for authority. She spoke as someone who had already survived Rome once. Cleopatra saw in Antony a different kind of Roman power, less disciplined than Caesar's, but more human, more susceptible to influence, and therefore more unpredictable. Their connection deepened not because of passion but because of necessity. Cleopatra understood that Antony would shape Rome's relationship with the East. Antony understood that Cleopatra could shape his authority there. Together they stood at the edge of a new arrangement. But Cleopatra did not forget Rome's nature. She knew that alliances in Rome were temporary, that affection did not protect against ambition, that the empire rewarded strength, not loyalty. Mark Antony was rising, and with his rise, Cleopatra faced another turning point, one that would test whether her careful balance between independence and alignment could survive a second time. History was offering her a familiar choice: trust Rome again, or prepare for its inevitable demand. She chose to engage, because Cleopatra understood that refusing the future did not prevent it. It only surrendered control over how it arrived. Alexandria changed at night. When the heat of the day loosened its grip and the harbor lights began to shimmer across the water, the city softened. Voices lowered, shadows stretched along marble corridors. The sea breathed steadily against the shore, as if reminding the city that it existed between worlds, between land and water, between past and future. It was during these nights that Cleopatra and Antony's alliance took shape, not in public ceremonies, not in proclamations, but in long conversations that unfolded after the formalities had ended. Antony arrived in Alexandria expecting obedience. What he encountered instead was invitation. Cleopatra did not challenge his authority openly, nor did she submit to it. She created a space where Rome's rigid expectations loosened, where power could be discussed rather than enforced. The palace became a place of rhythm rather than command. Music drifted through open halls, lamps burned low, wine was poured, but never allowed to dull the conversation. Cleopatra curated the atmosphere carefully. She understood that Antony responded to presence more than protocol, to experience more than abstraction. These nights were not indulgent in the way Rome later described them. They were strategic. Cleopatra spoke to Antony about Egypt, not as a treasure to be extracted, but as a system that required balance. She explained the Nile's cycles, the dependency of Rome on Egyptian grain, the delicate relationship between temples and people. She did not overwhelm him with detail. She selected what mattered. Antony listened. He was accustomed to advisors who spoke in calculations and threats. Cleopatra spoke in context. She framed Egypt as a partner that needed respect in order to function. Rome could take from Egypt, she implied, but it would take more if it allowed Egypt to remain whole. This appealed to Antony's instincts. He was a soldier, not an administrator. He understood supply lines. He understood morale. Cleopatra spoke to him in a language he recognized, one of maintenance rather than domination. Over time, their discussions drifted beyond politics. They spoke about history, about Alexander, about Caesar, about the strange weight of inheriting worlds already in decline. Cleopatra shared her belief that rulers were shaped less by destiny than by timing. Antony spoke of loyalty, of betrayal, of the exhaustion that came with constant vigilance. Alexandria offered him relief. In Rome, every gesture was scrutinized. Every decision became ammunition. In Egypt, Antony found a space where his authority was not constantly contested, where he could exist without performing power at every moment. Cleopatra understood the danger of this comfort. She did not encourage escape. She encouraged engagement. She did not present Alexandria as an alternative to Rome, but as its Eastern reflection, different but equally serious. Rome would later accuse Cleopatra of seducing Antony away from duty. The truth was quieter. She gave him something Rome did not know how to provide: continuity without humiliation. These nights blurred boundaries. Egyptian ritual mingled with Roman custom. Greek philosophy returned in conversation. Cleopatra did not imitate Rome's values. She absorbed them, translated them, placed them beside her own. Antony began to see the East differently, not as excess, but as complexity. Cleopatra was not weakening him. She was expanding his understanding of the territory he governed. Together they crafted a vision of power that unsettled Rome, not because it was decadent, but because it was independent. Alexandria, under Cleopatra, did not behave like a subordinate city. It behaved like a center, a place where decisions could be made rather than received, a place where Rome's Eastern authority could be stabilized through cooperation rather than fear. This was dangerous. Rome tolerated strength only when it was visibly Roman. Cleopatra's Egypt did not pretend to be Roman. It remained itself, ancient, confident, deliberate. As Antony spent more time in Alexandria, rumors traveled west, senators whispered, rivals sharpened narratives. Cleopatra became a symbol onto which Rome projected its anxieties: luxury, foreignness, loss of control. The nights in Alexandria were recast as indulgence rather than diplomacy. Cleopatra knew this would happen. She had learned long ago that Rome explained what it feared by moralizing it. What could not be controlled had to be condemned. Still, she did not not retreat. She understood that power required presence, that alliances required intimacy, not emotional vulnerability, but intellectual trust. Antony trusted her judgment. He deferred to her understanding of the East. This trust, once established, was difficult to break. For Cleopatra, these nights were a calculated risk. She was drawing Rome's Eastern authority closer, reshaping it from within. She was making herself essential not only to Egypt's stability, but to Antony's identity as a ruler. The palace glowed softly against the darkness. Alexandria slept, and within its walls, two worlds were being carefully stitched together, thread by thread, conversation by conversation, night after night. The world outside would soon notice, and when it did, it would not be forgiving. Rome never knew how to speak about power without turning it into morality. When Antony's connection to Cleopatra became impossible to ignore, Rome searched for language sharp enough to contain its discomfort. It found that language in accusation. What could not be explained as strategy was rebranded as weakness. What could not be controlled was reduced to desire. Love, Rome decided, was the story it would tell. Cleopatra understood this instinct well. She had learned long ago that powerful women were rarely described as rational actors. Their decisions were explained away as emotion, their intelligence reframed as manipulation. Rome did not need to understand her motives, it needed to diminish them. Cleopatra allowed the story to spread. She did not deny affection, she did not correct exaggeration. She understood that Rome's focus on romance distracted from something more dangerous: the fact that Egypt and Rome's eastern territories were functioning smoothly under her influence. While Rome debated Antony's loyalty, Cleopatra governed. She and Antony formalized their alliance in ways that mattered more than public ceremony. Territories were reorganized, resources were secured, Egypt's borders were stabilized. Cleopatra ensured that her children were recognized within this arrangement, not as Roman heirs, but as legitimate rulers of Eastern lands. This was not indulgence, it was architecture. Cleopatra knew that symbols endure longer than treaties. She presented herself not as a Roman consort, but as a sovereign equal. When Antony stood beside her, it was not as a conqueror displaying spoils, but as a partner acknowledging authority. This distinction mattered. Rome had no language for such an arrangement. Its political imagination was built on hierarchy, on submission and command. Cleopatra's presence disrupted that structure. She did not fit into Rome's categories, so Rome turned her into a cautionary tale. The East, Rome said, had corrupted Antony. Luxury had softened him. Love had weakened his judgment. Cleopatra watched this narrative unfold without surprise. She had anticipated it. By allowing Rome to frame the alliance as personal rather than political, she bought time. While Rome argued, Egypt consolidated. While senators moralized, grain continued to flow. While Antony's rivals focused on image, Cleopatra focused on continuity. Love, in this context, became camouflage. But Cleopatra was not naive. She knew that intimacy carried real risk. Antony was not Caesar. He was more vulnerable to impulse, more affected by perception. Cleopatra balanced closeness with caution. She did not isolate him from Rome. She did not encourage abandonment of duty. She encouraged integration, an Eastern Rome that could coexist with Egypt rather than dominate it. This vision frightened Rome more than romance ever could. An empire can tolerate indulgence. It cannot tolerate alternatives. As Antony spent more time in Alexandria, Rome's anxiety sharpened into opposition. Another Roman was rising in the west, colder, younger, and far more disciplined. He watched Antony carefully. He listened to the stories being told, and he understood how to use them. Cleopatra sensed the shift. She knew that Rome's tolerance had limits, that the narrative of love would eventually be weaponized. She began preparing for a future in which affection would no longer protect strategy, but she did not retreat. Cleopatra had chosen her position deliberately. She had bound Egypt's survival to visibility rather than submission. She understood that disappearing would not save her. Only definition could. Love, for Cleopatra, was never surrender, it was alignment. She allowed Rome to misunderstand her intentions because misunderstanding delayed confrontation, and delay, in a world racing toward consolidation, was a resource. Cleopatra did not ask Rome to approve of her. She asked only that it continue to depend on Egypt. For a time, that was enough. But Rome does not forgive dependence when it begins to feel like reliance. And soon the story of love would no longer be sufficient to disguise what was really at stake, the question of who would define the future of the Mediterranean world. Rome did not declare war on Mark Antony. It declared war on Cleopatra. This distinction mattered more than any fleet or legion. It revealed the shape of Rome's fear and the precision of its strategy. By turning Cleopatra into the enemy, Rome transformed a political conflict into a moral one, simple, persuasive, and easy to repeat. Octavian understood this instinctively. Younger than Antony, quieter, and far more disciplined, Octavian ruled through narrative as much as through force. He watched Rome's anxieties gather around Cleopatra and gave them direction. The problem, he said, was not civil war, it was foreign influence, not rivalry, but corruption, not Antony's ambition, but Cleopatra's power. Rome's streets filled with carefully chosen words. Cleopatra was no longer a queen, she was an enchantress, a manipulator, a foreign woman who had bent Roman men away from duty. The East, Rome was told, had always been dangerous, soft, excessive, untrustworthy. Cleopatra became the embodiment of that danger. This framing was deliberate. Rome could not easily condemn Antony without condemning itself. He was Roman, a veteran, a hero of Caesar's wars. But Cleopatra existed outside Rome's moral boundaries. She could be made into anything Rome needed her to be, and Rome needed a villain. Octavian sharpened the image carefully. He did not attack Egypt directly. He attacked the idea of Egypt ruling Rome's destiny. He spoke of Antony's loyalty being divided, of Roman resources being drained eastward, of a queen who dared to imagine herself equal to Rome. The implication was clear. Cleopatra was not resisting Rome, she was replacing it. This accusation struck deep. Rome had always defined itself against kings, against queens, against the very concept of shared sovereignty. Cleopatra's presence exposed a contradiction Rome could not tolerate. That power might exist outside its control and still function. The Senate listened. The people listened. Rome had been trained to fear monarchy. Cleopatra offered Rome not a crown, but a mirror, and Rome recoiled. Cleopatra felt the shift long before it became official. Messages from Rome grew colder. Antony's position became more precarious. Advisors urged caution. Allies hesitated. The atmosphere changed, not suddenly, but unmistakably. The space for compromise narrowed. Cleopatra did not panic. She had expected this moment. She understood that Rome's turn against her was not personal. It was structural. Rome could not allow a foreign queen to exist as a central figure in its Eastern governance. The precedent alone was intolerable. So Cleopatra prepared. She reinforced Egypt's defenses. She secured loyalty where she could. She emphasized Egypt's independence rather than its partnership. Antony, caught between Rome and Alexandria, struggled to maintain balance. Cleopatra watched him carefully. She knew Antony was no longer just her ally. He was now Rome's vulnerability, and Rome was pressing hard. Octavian framed every delay, every absence, every decision as evidence of Antony's betrayal. The narrative tightened. Rome was not fighting Antony and Cleopatra. It was rescuing itself from them. When war was finally declared, it was done with symbolic precision. Rome did not name Antony as the enemy. It named Cleopatra, the foreign queen, the imagined tyrant, the threat to Roman virtue. This decision sealed everything. Cleopatra understood its meaning immediately. There would be no negotiation now, no quiet realignment. Rome had committed itself to a story that required her defeat, and stories like that demand endings. Cleopatra stood once again at the center of a world turning against her. She had been here before, exiled, underestimated, framed as dangerous. But this time, the the stakes were higher. The conflict would not be resolved through words or proximity. It would be resolved through force. Rome had turned against the queen, and in doing so it had ensured that whatever happened next would echo far beyond Egypt's shores, into history, into legend, into memory that no empire could fully control. The battle did not begin at sea. It began years earlier, in words spoken in Rome, in fears repeated until they hardened into certainty. By the time fleets gathered near Actium, the outcome had already been shaped by perception. What remained was execution. Cleopatra understood this. She knew that Rome was no longer testing strength. It was proving dominance. The war was not about territory alone. It was about narrative. Rome needed a decisive ending, one that could be retold simply. Cleopatra and Antony had become symbols, and symbols must fall clearly. Still, the ships assembled. The waters near Actium filled with Roman vessels, heavy, disciplined, designed for direct engagement. Antony's forces, reinforced by Egyptian ships, were formidable but divided. Loyalties wavered. Confidence eroded quietly. Cleopatra was present. Rome would later frame her presence as vanity or interference. The truth was more measured. Cleopatra understood supply lines, naval logistics, and the political cost of absence. This was not Antony's war alone. Egypt's future rested on the outcome. Yet something was wrong. The cohesion Cleopatra had once helped build had weakened. Antony was under immense pressure, from Rome's accusations, from the expectations of his allies, from the knowledge that he was fighting not only Octavian's forces, but Rome's identity itself. Morale is fragile. Cleopatra saw it fraying long before the first clash. When the battle finally unfolded, it lacked the clarity Rome would later claim. Ships maneuvered, orders hesitated, engagement stalled. What should have been decisive became uncertain. Antony's fleet did not move as one. Command fractured under strain. Cleopatra made a choice. She withdrew her ships. History would reduce this moment to a single word: flight, cowardice, betrayal. Rome would seize upon it eagerly, reshaping the retreat into proof of everything it claimed about the East. Cleopatra's reasoning was more complex. She saw that the battle was no longer winnable, that prolonging engagement would mean annihilation rather than defeat. She understood that Egypt's survival required preserving what could still be saved. Antony followed her. This decision sealed their fate. To Rome, the withdrawal confirmed its narrative. The East had corrupted Antony. Cleopatra had lured him away from honor. The battle was no longer analyzed, it was moralized. The war ended in that moment, even if fighting continued elsewhere. Cleopatra returned to Egypt carrying the weight of irreversible loss. The fleet that had once represented independence now represented failure. Allies vanished. Messages stopped arriving. Rome's victory became inevitable. But Cleopatra did not collapse. She had anticipated loss. What she had not anticipated was how thoroughly Rome would control the story. Actium would not be remembered as a complex confrontation shaped by politics and exhaustion. It would be remembered as a moment of weakness. Cleopatra understood this was intentional. Rome needed a clean ending, a moment where blame could be assigned and absorbed. Actium served that purpose perfectly. The battle that was already lost had finally been performed. Cleopatra stood again at the edge of survival, facing not merely defeat but erasure. Rome would not be satisfied with submission. It would demand demonstration. The future narrowed rapidly, and Cleopatra once more prepared not for victory but for authorship. Defeat did not arrive in Egypt with fire and shouting. It arrived quietly. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria without ceremony. There were no crowds waiting at the harbor, no proclamations announcing her arrival. The city continued its routines, as cities do, even when the future has begun to close in. Markets opened, ships docked, priests performed rituals whose words had survived countless endings. But the dream that had sustained Egypt's independence was unraveling. Slowly at first, allies stopped responding. Promised reinforcements never appeared. The political network Cleopatra had carefully maintained dissolved under pressure. Loyalty, she had learned long ago, was strongest when backed by momentum. Now momentum belonged to Rome. Antony retreated inward. The man who had once commanded armies and held half the Roman world in his grasp withdrew from decisions, from strategy, from himself. Defeat had not destroyed his forces so much as his certainty. Cleopatra watched this transformation with sorrow and clarity. She did not blame him. She understood what it meant to carry the weight of a collapsing world. Alexandria became a city waiting for judgment. Roman ships appeared closer along the coast. News traveled faster than hope. Cleopatra's advisors urged surrender, negotiation, escape. Each option carried its own form of disappearance. Cleopatra listened without illusion. She knew Rome's intentions. Octavian did not need Egypt to fight. He needed Egypt to submit. And more importantly, he needed Cleopatra alive, paraded, displayed, reduced to proof of Rome's moral victory. This knowledge shaped every decision she made. Cleopatra began preparing for an ending she could control. She secured the safety of her children where possible. She organized the palace archives. She ensured that Egypt's rituals continued, even as Rome approached. These acts were not denial. They were preservation, the dream of a shared Eastern power, of Rome and Egypt balancing one another, was gone. What remained was dignity. Cleopatra walked through the palace at night, touching the stone walls she had known since childhood. These corridors had seen generations of rulers rise and fall. They had absorbed whispers, arguments, ambitions. Now they witnessed the final hours of a dynasty. She did not rage. She did not plead. She accepted what history had decided, but not how it would be remembered. Antony, isolated and consumed by despair, acted rashly. Misunderstandings compounded loss. His end came without ceremony, marked by confusion rather than clarity. Cleopatra mourned him privately without spectacle. Their partnership had been flawed, but it had been real. Together they had tried to imagine an alternative to Rome's singular future. That imagination had failed. Rome entered Egypt not as a force of chaos, but as inevitability. Octavian advanced methodically, confident in victory, careful to preserve what he intended to rule. Cleopatra watched from within the palace, as the machinery of empire closed in. The dream did not shatter, it faded, piece by piece, decision by decision, silence by silence. Cleopatra understood now that survival, in Rome's terms, would mean transformation into something unrecognizable, a captive queen, a symbol emptied of agency, a lesson displayed for others. She would not accept that version of herself. As Alexandria prepared for occupation, Cleopatra prepared for authorship. She considered what Rome could take and what it could not. Armies could seize cities, empires could rewrite histories, but meaning chosen deliberately remained elusive. The slow collapse of the dream left space for one final act, not of resistance, but of control. Cleopatra stood at the end of possibility, facing a future she had long understood was never truly hers to shape. Yet even now, even here, she retained one power Rome could not claim, the power to decide how her story would end. And in that decision, the legend was already beginning to form. Cleopatra did not wait for Rome to summon her. She prepared to meet it. As Octavian's forces closed in on Alexandria, the palace shifted from a center of rule to a stage carefully arranged for a final appearance. Cleopatra understood the nature of Roman victory. Conquest alone was not enough. Rome required spectacle. It required a defeated enemy to be seen, categorized, and absorbed into its story. Cleopatra refused to arrive unprepared. She dressed with intention, choosing garments that spoke in symbols Rome could not fully decode, not the excess Rome accused her of, but restraint. Gold used sparingly, lines clean, the image of a queen who still commanded herself, even as the world around her narrowed. When Octavian entered the palace, he did not meet a broken ruler. He met a woman who understood exactly what he needed and what she could deny him. Cleopatra spoke calmly. She did not argue the outcome of the war. She did not plead for mercy. She framed herself as a rational actor in a conflict already decided. Egypt, she implied, could be governed efficiently if treated with care. Disorder would benefit no one. Octavian listened with polite distance. He was not Caesar. He did not seek partnership. He sought closure. Cleopatra sensed this immediately. Octavian did not see her as a ruler. He saw her as an ending, something to be transported to Rome, displayed before the people, and reduced to proof of Roman superiority. This realization clarified everything. Cleopatra adjusted her strategy. If she could not preserve Egypt's independence, she would preserve Egypt's dignity. She spoke carefully, offering cooperation without surrendering her identity. She observed Octavian closely, noting his discipline, his caution, his refusal to be drawn into personal exchange. He was immune to intimacy. That, she understood, made him dangerous. Cleopatra was kept under watch, but not imprisoned. Octavian wanted her alive and presentable. He imagined her in Rome, walking behind his triumphal chariot, a living symbol of the East subdued. Cleopatra imagined the same scene and rejected it. She spent her final days arranging details others might have overlooked. She ensured her children were placed beyond immediate reach. She organized her affairs with precision. She spoke to her attendants with calm finality, not as a woman surrendering, but as a ruler concluding her reign. This was not despair, it was authorship. Cleopatra had lived her life, understanding the power of presentation. Now, at the end, she understood it more clearly than ever. Rome would take her body if allowed. It would take her image if she surrendered it. But there remained one thing Rome could not command: her ending. The palace grew quiet. Outside, the city adjusted to new banners and new authority. Inside, Cleopatra prepared for a final act, not meant for Rome's audience, but for history's memory. This would not be a performance of defeat. It would be a refusal. And in that refusal, Cleopatra would secure what she had always guarded most fiercely. Not her throne, not her alliances, but her meaning. The world believed her story was ending. Cleopatra knew it was only changing form. Cleopatra did not choose death in a moment of panic. She chose it slowly, deliberately, with the same clarity that had guided her through power and loss. By the time the decision was made, it felt less like an ending than a conclusion long anticipated. Rome had left her no space to remain herself. Alive, she would become an object, transported, displayed, spoken over. Her voice would be replaced by Roman narration. Her body would serve as evidence of victory, her presence reduced to a lesson Rome could repeat whenever it wished to warn others. Cleopatra understood what survival would mean. It would mean erasure. She had seen it happen before, to kings, to cultures, to ideas absorbed and reshaped until nothing of their original intent remained. Rome did not merely defeat its enemies, it repurposed them. Cleopatra would not be repurposed. In the quiet of her chambers, she reviewed the paths left open to her. Escape was no longer possible. Negotiation had narrowed into spectacle. Delay would change nothing. Each option led to the same outcome. A life continued without agency. So she chose the only remaining form of control. The details of her death would later be argued over endlessly. A serpent, a poison, a hidden vial. Rome itself was unsure. The uncertainty suited Cleopatra. The method mattered less than the message. She did not die as a captive. She died as a queen. Her final moments were not theatrical. There were no speeches meant for record, no gestures designed to be witnessed. She acted quietly, attended only by those who had remained loyal to the end. Cleopatra understood something Rome did not anticipate. By choosing death, she denied Rome the ending it needed. There would be no triumphal display, no public humiliation, no visual proof of the East subdued and paraded through Roman streets. Octavian would win Egypt, but he would not win Cleopatra. Her death disrupted Rome's narrative. It forced Rome to explain what it could not control. In doing so, it preserved ambiguity, and ambiguity allowed memory to resist domination. Cleopatra's body was found, still adorned as a queen, untouched by the spectacle Rome had prepared. Even in death, she remained composed, deliberate, self-contained. Rome was left with absence, and absence, unlike defeat, cannot be displayed. Cleopatra's choice transformed her from a political figure into something more enduring. No longer a ruler negotiating survival, she became a boundary, marking where Roman power ended and legend began. She did not defeat Rome, she refused it. That refusal echoed. It traveled through Roman histories, through poetry, through rumor and retelling. Each version of her death carried uncertainty, and within that uncertainty, Cleopatra retained agency. The woman Rome sought to reduce became impossible to fully define. In choosing death, Cleopatra preserved her story from closure. She ensured that no single empire would own its ending. Her life had been shaped by timing, intelligence, and restraint. Her death was shaped by authorship, and in that final decision, Cleopatra secured what she had been protecting all along. Not her kingdom, which was already gone, but her meaning. The queen disappeared. The legend remained. Rome won the war. Egypt was annexed, its treasury emptied into Roman hands. Its grain flowed west without negotiation. The ancient kingdom that had once imagined itself eternal was now a province, administered by officials who spoke of efficiency rather than gods. In practical terms, the matter was settled, but Rome was never satisfied with victory alone. It needed interpretation. Octavian understood this better than most. He had defeated Antony and Cleopatra, not only on the battlefield, but in meaning, and meaning, once shaped, could outlast armies. Cleopatra's death had denied him spectacle, but it had not denied him authorship. Rome would still tell the story, it would simply tell it louder. The first Roman accounts appeared quickly. Cleopatra was described as dangerous, excessive, irrational, a woman who ruled through seduction rather than intelligence, a foreign queen who had ensnared Roman men and nearly pulled the Republic into Eastern decadence. Her intelligence was reframed as cunning, her diplomacy as manipulation, her authority as illegitimate. These descriptions were not accidents. Rome had a long tradition of explaining political anxiety through character assassination. Cleopatra was useful precisely because she existed outside Roman norms. She could be made to represent everything Rome feared about the East: luxury, instability, emotional excess, the blurring of boundaries between power and pleasure. By reducing Cleopatra to a stereotype, Rome reduced the threat she had posed. The narrative was simple and effective. Antony, Rome said, had been a great man undone by desire. Cleopatra was the embodiment of that desire. Rome, by contrast, was discipline, restraint, order restored. The moral lesson was clear enough to be repeated in speeches, poems, and histories, but simplicity always hides complexity. Rome did not speak of Cleopatra's education. It did not emphasize her command of languages, her understanding of economics, her ability to maintain Egypt's stability in an era of collapse. These details complicated the story. They suggested agency rather than temptation, so they were softened or removed. Cleopatra became a warning rather than a ruler. Octavian, now Augustus, presented himself as the restorer of balance. He framed Egypt's annexation not as conquest, but as necessity. Cleopatra's death, in this version, was tragic but inevitable, the end of a dangerous deviation from Roman order. Rome's poets followed suit. They wrote of the exotic queen, the perfumed palace, the nights of indulgence. Alexandria was painted as a place of excess rather than strategy. Egypt became a dream from which Rome had heroically awakened. This version traveled far. It was repeated in schools, recited in public spaces, embedded in the cultural memory of the empire. Over time, it hardened into something that felt like fact. But stories once released do not remain obedient forever. Cleopatra's image began to fracture. Some Roman writers, even as they condemned her, could not help but admire her resolve. They noted her composure in defeat, her refusal to be paraded, her choice of death over humiliation. These details slipped through the cracks of propaganda. Rome had intended to erase her authority. Instead, it preserved her defiance. Outside Rome, the story shifted again. In Egypt, Cleopatra was remembered not as a seductress, but as the last ruler who had tried to hold the world together. In the Eastern Mediterranean, she lingered as a symbol of resistance, not to Rome's armies, but to its claim of inevitability. Centuries passed. Rome itself changed. Fractured, fell. Empires replaced empires. Languages transformed. Temples crumbled. But Cleopatra did not disappear with them. Her image adapted, survived, resurfaced. Each era found its own version of her. A villain, a heroine, a romantic figure, a political genius, none of them complete. Rome had written the first version of Cleopatra's story. It did not write the last. The very effort to control her meaning ensured its escape. Cleopatra's refusal to provide Rome with a clean ending left space for reinterpretation. Her death created ambiguity, and ambiguity invited memory rather than closure. Rome wanted her to be a lesson. History turned her into a question. Who was Cleopatra really? A queen who failed? A woman who loved unwisely, or a ruler who understood too clearly what Rome demanded and refused to comply? Rome could annex Egypt, it could seize gold and grain, it could reorganize the world, but it could not fully own Cleopatra. And in that failure, the legend began to grow beyond Rome's reach, quietly, persistently, waiting for a future that would look back and see her not through Roman fear, but through historical distance. The empire believed it had finished the story. It had only begun the argument. Cleopatra did not become a legend because she was flawless. She became a legend because she stood at the exact moment when one world was ending and another was still uncertain how to define itself. History often forgets those who rule during stability. It remembers those who govern collapse. Cleopatra ruled an ancient kingdom at the moment when age itself became a liability. Egypt had survived for millennia by believing in continuity, cycles, rituals, gods who promised balance. Rome offered something different: linear progress, expansion without return, power that moved forward and erased what stood behind it. Cleopatra understood both systems. She was not trapped in the past, nor fully committed to Rome's future. She lived between them, translating one world to the other, attempting to preserve meaning where force had begun to dominate. This position was inherently unstable, and instability creates memory. Cleopatra did not rule through conquest. She ruled through comprehension. She understood language, symbolism, economy, timing. She knew when to speak and when silence would carry more weight. She knew that survival in a changing world required adaptability rather than nostalgia. That adaptability frightened Rome. Empires prefer enemies they can defeat openly. Cleopatra did not present herself as an enemy. She presented herself as an alternative, a different model of authority that did not rely on domination alone. Rome could not allow that. So Rome simplified her. It turned her into desire, into excess, into a warning. But simplification is never complete. Cleopatra's intelligence survived the caricature. Her composure in defeat resisted erasure. Her refusal to be displayed disrupted Rome's victory ritual. Even in loss, She denied the empire its preferred ending. This refusal mattered. Legends are not created by triumph alone. They are created by boundaries, by moments where power fails to fully assert itself. Cleopatra marked such a boundary. Rome conquered Egypt, but it did not conquer her meaning. That is why her story did not settle. Each generation returned to her, reshaping her image according to its own fears and desires. Sometimes she was romanticized, sometimes condemned, sometimes reclaimed as a strategist rather than a seductress. The argument itself kept her alive. Cleopatra's legend endures because it resists closure. She was the last pharaoh and the first figure of a new world where empires justified themselves through narrative rather than divinity. She exposed how power depends on storytelling as much as on force. Her life revealed a truth that still unsettles, that intelligence without empire is threatening, that sovereignty without conformity invites destruction, and that refusing humiliation can echo longer than victory. Cleopatra did not save Egypt. She saved something quieter and more enduring. The idea that a ruler could choose dignity over survival, that a woman could stand at the center of empire and refuse to be reduced. That history, no matter how forcefully written, remains open to revision. That is why Cleopatra became a legend, not because she ruled Rome, not because she defeated her enemies, but because she refused to disappear into the version of herself that Rome needed. The empire passed, the stories remained, and somewhere between fact and memory, between history and imagination, Cleopatra continues to stand, not as a myth to be consumed, but as a question that refuses to fade.